First, I would like to ask a question. Is it the object or is it the image of object that is the most important in its reception? In contemporary craft today, it's hard to say which is taking precedence. The slide behind me confronts this exact question, where some of you may know the original image of this work, Shadows of Manhattan. You may notice the image is actually more widely recognized than the object. By the way, the object is at the RISD Museum. Anyway, at which point you may wonder what experience is the most real or powerful and why that is. It could be argued that when craft is brought into the fine arts context, it's redefined by a history of visuality, like the Shadows of Manhattan. And if you're not familiar with the actual piece, it's shown right there. But craft, unlike the fine arts, is not defined by visual aesthetic as much as tactile experience, social experience, and the manipulation of material. Craft, from the Saxon word for power and strength, represents a set of ideas and beliefs that actually are not equivalent to a history of visuality. Historically, craft was considered a general term for many arts, and craft was defined as a calling requiring special skill and knowledge, but did not necessarily designate a particular medium. Until the late Hellenistic and Roman era, the arts were then divided by liberal or servile. The liberal arts were considered intellectual and appropriate to the high-born and educated. The servile or vulgar arts involved physical labor and payment for services. So, for instance, music study was a liberal art, but actually playing the instrument was a vulgar art. And Leonardo deemed that painting was an intellectual pursuit, whereas sculpture was a hand labor, and so on and so forth. This began to designate specific materials and labor within the hierarchy of art. And as you may have guessed, craft has never been able to escape being a servile or vulgar art, given it's dependent on handwork and association with utility. Recently, craft has been pushing against the traditional values that have been markers of its history. Because my background is in jewelry and metalsmithing, that will be a main focus of this talk, but it isn't to say that other craft examples don't exist. So far we've discussed how image has changed our perception of object and how craft as object is traditionally defined. And since we began this discussion with how a photograph has changed our experience with the Shadows of Manhattan, I would like to continue with the ways in which photography has played a role in the craft dialogue, contributing to the disappearance of the physical object. Photography has been employed as both a transformative method of creating craft and for the documentation of performance in ephemera. The importance of process, much like its focus in the art world, has become a demanded piece of the conceptual artifacts. And this can be demonstrated by photographic documentation as an additional facet of a piece, or by using the photograph as the piece itself. Oftentimes a photograph will stand in place of a work and hold more importance than the physical thing. This is especially prominent when the thing itself no longer exists because of the ephemeral or performative qualities. The concept of display for this reason becomes as important, and sometimes more important, than the thing itself being displayed. The preference for visual experience within an artistic domain has been a long discussed phenomenon throughout museology, but this preference has actually changed the physical fields of craft. The experience of craft has shifted from an object-based understanding to a subject-based visuality, and documents of visuality trump the objecthood of the craft itself. These performance-based and process-driven craft practices can be traced to post-World War II, when many former military pursued academic studio training. Many of the programs were heavily influenced by Bauhaus philosophies which unified art, craft, and technology. Professors and students of the Bauhaus immigrated to the United States and integrated their training throughout United States academia. Many new forms of art practice that emerged in the post-war era were characterized by an emphasis on performance, materiality, and process, leading to a broader definition of the field. These practices produced craft that often represented the dematerialized object and a freedom from strict utility. Originally, performative practices activated participation and engagement with the audience. To quote Valerie Casso, quote, "Extensions into performance and performativity fed into the autonomy of craft and also left an indelible imprint on the potential of contemporary expression, not only to create theater, but also to tear down the fourth wall, which regulated the viewer to a passive role." The performativity that craft's process allows for and its integration into Bauhaus ideologies creates a different kind of relationship between maker and audience. Bearing in mind the benefits of participatory performance in craft, the performative aspects can also prove to be a negation of object. The reciprocity between craftsman and audience can cause the finished object to be less important than the performance. As Glenn Adamson addresses in his book Perpetual Motion, when one does encounter craft in this digital age, It is usually the process and not the product that counts. The process is the product. The most valued objects that come out of craft-based performances are often photographs of the event or of the ephemeral object created in the spirit of performativity. The craft object's importance transfers to the object of the photograph, thus abandoning its ties to tactility. Objects are exchanged for visual productions, which are then perceived for their documentation abilities or for their visual aesthetic. The change in the craft field when represented by the photograph exists in the way it's experienced. Beginning with documentary photographs of performances, photographs have persisted as an acceptable substitute for craft. As jewelry has pushed against traditional craft expectations of object longevity, technique, and placement on the body, photography has played a major role in the redefinition of the field. Heisbacher's embrace is a laminated photograph that's life-size. The photograph is the jewelry's medium and acts like a necklace, but the photograph of it being worn is equally as important. The neck piece is a photograph depicting a cropped body from an aerial view of the top of a man's head, shoulders, and arms. The photograph is in black and white, making it distinct from the body that it's worn on. The aerial perspective is one made famous by the presence of cameras, and the decision to use this speaks to the history of photography. The anonymity of the man in the photograph helps to feature the wearer of the work as the subject, and the title of the work, Embrace, fulfills itself when worn. On the body, the necklace becomes an embrace in two different ways. The image, when worn, looks as if the photographed man is hugging the wearer, but the name of the work also speaks to the nature of jewelry, because every necklace hangs on the neck of its wearer, creating an embrace through object. The work is placed between the two media, jewelry and photography, as object and way of viewing. The work bridges jewelry, the body, and the image successfully, which paved the way for others to create similar works between these genres later. The jewelry still has a place in the world as physical object. It fits the body, and the wearer can choose to perform in order to fit the body to it. Bacher uses photographs in the service of his artistic concepts. One technique that Bacher used and continues to use is photography within the work itself and an exterior photograph to show its completion, reaching its peak within his portfolios in the 1980s. The neck piece Embrace, for example, is made from a photograph but does not make sense as jewelry until completed with the exterior photograph of it on the model. Even the review by Marjorie Simon of Heisbacher's retrospective book describes the photographic process as, beginning in the 1980s, Bacher used the format of photographic and appropriated images. Bacher places the human body inside the jewelry, as in his Embrace necklace, in which a life-size laminated photograph figure surrounds the neck of a live model. Simon points to the exterior photograph as being the piece. The exterior photograph is important because the jewelry and the body ultimately share a medium in the final image, and most importantly, both are needed to create a piece. A photographic image was created to construct the neck piece, the body performs to demonstrate the concept, the final image is created, but it remains as a functional jewelry work with or without the exterior conceptual photograph. Bacher's jewelry works question the materiality of jewelry as much as the nature of jewelry itself. When photography is purposefully incorporated into a work, it's to explore the concept of the individual jeweler. Many times, it acts as a critique of the nature of jewelry that suggests haptic engagement is crucial to its success. Bacher's Embrace represents the emergence of this kind of commentary of jewelry on jewelry. It not only looks at jewelry's contemporary tendency to abandon permanence, but also to use photography as a way to activate narrative and extend upon concept. Unlike other jewelers who have used photography for socio-political purposes, like Art Smith, or for an emphasis on genre, like Margaret Zapata, Bacher's photographs are taken to underscore the need for physical engagement with object. Paradoxically, by photographing the work to show the needed engagement with the body, it removes the viewer one step further from the actual work. While the exterior representative photograph is meant to be neutral, it's actually changed the method of experience. Some makers, like Caroline Gore, actually use the photograph as a source for the object. In this image, you can see she's taken a picture and used that to create the brooch. Similarly, in this image, she's also taken a source image to use for the creation of object. She's not using the body as a source, but rather a photograph. Many jewelers have used photography as if it's a neutral documentary process. In opposition to this, Caroline Gore's work is indicative of the way that photography is treated in its own right, and how its view of the world can change other fields upon its introduction. Gore's humorous portrayal of photographic mishaps alludes to a critique of the field. Some argue that photographic mishaps are what make photographs not strictly representative, but special. Gore's work, Shadow Pants, allows the viewer to find the humor in this photographic misrepresentation. When the misrepresentation is pulled into the real world and made into a real object, it becomes humorous. It allows the viewer to recognize that the camera changes in experience and varies from our own ocular experiences. Specifically, shadow pants in photographic form was only made possible because of the way a camera processes light and points to what it lacks in comparison to human eyesight. It gives dimension to the photographic view and comments on the effect on the jewelry field. Caroline Gore's Shadow Pants is a work that was sourced from a photograph, and the majority of the brooch is made from sterling and cotton. There are multiple white cotton pieces with black tops layered on top of one another, and the pinback extends the entire length of the work, meaning that the pants can't change their pattern. The series of layered objects is meant to reference the photographic image. It's meant to be worn on the body, but the body is not its main inspiration. The photographic source image is that of a man in Italy that, with the reflections of light through the room into the camera lens, creates an image of a thing that was transient. The human eye did not see glowing white pants, but the camera perceived the light in this way, creating an image from temporary circumstances. Gore's site-specific works are dependent on the photograph to complete the understanding of the work. The work itself, while interesting on its own, creates a narrative by the understanding of the photograph. Photography itself can become the referent for jewelry instead of the body being the main referent. Caroline Gore's Shadow Pants is sourced from an image that could not exist without the photograph. Unlike Bacher, Gore's work does not need the body in order to complete the work. It needs the photograph, and this mutual dependency for generating interest still ultimately needs to value the photograph before the work itself. Without the source photographs, these forms of jewelry would not be entirely understood. Also, Gore points to the way light is translated through the camera lens versus the human eye. This light perception of her Shadow Pants photograph is represented as a real thing that has been brought into the physical world. While light is non-physical, the photograph makes it physical, and Gore's translation of the light image has the viewer question the validity of photographic perception and the way in which sight is understood. But as the object pushes further against craft boundaries, the object has become in many ways incidental to the work. Some makers look at objects as a way to create temporary marks on the body, or temporary marks on clothing. And it's the temporary markings that are the jewelry and not the object. Some jewelers look to ephemeral arrangement of objects as jewelry. The authorship of these arrangements as jewelry are captured by the photograph. But it's becoming more acceptable to not incorporate objects at all. What remains is the photograph as documentation and eventually as the work itself. The ways in which our bodies respond to objects is generally a focus of the work, and like this piece, the photograph is the only way to capture the moment. In many ways, though, this is more performative than it is craft. The belief that craft is a calling requiring special skill and technique, one that is dependent on an intimate knowledge of material, is not present in many of these kinds of works. The works that do approach craftsmanship in terms of materiality, like Kim's piece, Lace Trace, look at the jewelry as ephemeral and the object to only be necessary for its execution. So the object is created in a very craft-oriented way, but the jewelry is a non-object. While performance artists of the 60s and 70s were not often concerned with documentation, jewelers creating ephemeral wares have always been quite particular about it. Jewelers compose their documentary photographs and videos in a way where once the piece is gone, the documentation stands in its place on purpose as the piece. The documentation is represented and displayed instead of the work itself. When the material of these crafts become abandoned, the materiality of the photograph begins to replace it. In John Berger's Ways of Seeing, he says, images were first made to conjure up the appearances of something that was absent. Gradually, it became evident that an image could outlast what it represented. But although the image lasts, it freezes the object within a moment in time, and its ability to be re-experienced is lost. In the 90s and 2000s, many jewelers tried to strip the materiality of their objects through the medium of photography, even if the works were not entirely ephemeral. Photography would, in theory, remove all associations to craft and leave the viewer with a two-dimensional image. This would liberate the jeweler from associations of making, material, and the body, and ultimately, the vulgar arts. Loren Coleman's body of work is often discussed as an extreme example of the way in which the photograph has become the jewelry. Her work begins a dialogue about the purpose of jewelry's physicality, but in my opinion also ignores the merits of photography as an object itself. Loren Coleman's tongue gilding from her hardware series is a digital print laminated on acrylic. The The photograph is 23 inches by 35 and hangs larger than life on the wall. It was never a physical object except as a photograph. It's shown in galleries and museums as a photograph and only lists the laminated print under materials, and yet it is still considered jewelry. It was not performed, but photographed in her private studio and witnessed by no other person. The photograph is the work that remains and was the intended medium for viewing it. And yet Coleman refers to herself as jeweler and this body of work as jewelry. When discussing the disappearance of object, it makes me wonder if the jewelry field is in the midst of an iconoclasm. It's hard to claim what the exact motivations of each maker would be in creating photographs or ephemera in place of an object, but if an iconoclasm is the destruction of an artifact that holds a belief, wouldn't the replacement of craft be a kind of iconoclasm? By taking craft and making a representation and not a tactile experience, does that destroy the series of ideas that define it? Does it remove craft from the vulgar arts? Or rather, does the disappearance of object reinforce the necessity of craft? Does it make us aware of how we need the experience of the tactile object? While I have no definitive answers to these questions, I ask you to consider them as craft continues to push through the contemporary into the hands of future makers. As the object disappears, it may actually make us more aware of why we crave the tactile experience and our desires for physical engagement with objects. Just like Barthes desired so strongly to reach through the photograph of his mother to touch the thing represented, we must also be aware that we have the power to persist in craft without sacrificing the desire to experience it. Thanks for having me.